What is up, guys? Welcome to my review for Arrow Season 6, Episode 19, titled The Dragon. So if you've seen my previous reviews and trailer breakdowns for the season, you probably know that a big complaint I have with the season is that the main villain, Ricardo Diaz, aka the Dragon, was extremely underdeveloped, and no other villain in the show has been this underdeveloped except for like Ra's al Ghul. So that was a big problem I've had with the season, which is why this episode really needed to happen. The reason that he wasn't that developed was because for the first 14 or 15 episodes there was a different main villain. Caden James was the main villain for most of the season until he wasn't anymore after the episode The Devil's Greatest Trick, and then Ricardo Diaz became the main villain. But the first 15 or 14 episodes, I don't remember how many exactly, there was just Caden James. Ricardo Diaz was in the background, and he was in like a couple episodes, but even the episodes he was in, he didn't really get much development. And even after he became the main villain, he wasn't never the main focus of the episodes, and I think that stops here with this episode. So this episode really needed to happen to develop the main villain, and it was great because the main villain got a huge spotlight. I mean, like, Oliver Queen was in 2 scenes. Oliver Queen himself was in 1 scene, but then there was a fight scene with Green Arrow, which Stephen Amell probably wasn't even there. It was probably just a stunt double. So Stephen Amell was in 1 scene in this episode, as far as I can tell. So that's crazy, because like in the last episode he was in almost every scene, and then this episode he's only in 1 scene. That there must be a reason behind that, and the reason is because they really wanted to focus on the dragon to develop him, and I'm not gonna lie, it worked really well. First of all, there was the logo in the beginning of Arrow, and you see a dragon in the background. That's something they've been doing this season, and I actually like it a lot. Like, before Team Arrow broke up, it was all of the Team Arrow logos with, like, Green Arrow, Overwatch, Spartan, Black Canary, Mr. Terrific, and Wild Dog. Well, once they broke up, it was just Arrow. It was just an Arrow. And now in this episode, because it's focusing a lot on Diaz, he is the main character of this episode, you see a dragon. So I thought that was really cool, and I hope they continue using this logo thing throughout the show, season 7, if this is season 8, that too, because I actually really like it, like, depending on who the main focus is on the episode. So this episode, we finally got to know more of Diaz's backstory. Like, he was orphaned as a kid. I don't think I knew that, and he was in an orphanage, and he was tortured by this older kid, which did get resolved in the end of the episode, which I will talk about in a second. But that whole backstory, the fact that we actually got backstory for the character, like a flashback, was actually pretty great. The actors who played those little kids were really cringy, because usually kid actors are. But that's besides the point, because I just like the fact that he finally got some sort of backstory. So now we know he was orphaned as a kid, and he also committed a crime he was framed for a crime. I'm pretty sure he was in jail for something he didn't do, which was what made him a villain. But I just really like the fact that we finally got some backstory for the character and finally got some development, because throughout the episode he got a lot of development. We saw like what makes him tick. We saw what makes him do what he does because of like the dragon. We saw where the dragon came from. All of that was great, and I love the fact that he's finally getting some development, because like no other villain has gotten this little development, like obviously except for Ra's al Ghul, like I said, and Ra's al Ghul wasn't a good villain in the slightest. So I'm really glad he's finally getting some development, and the way he got in this episode worked really well. Like the thing with the dragon, the story with the dragon, how it was his fear and then he called it something. I thought that was actually a pretty cool story, and it really gave him some character. That's a big thing. A big problem with his character is that he didn't really have much of it. He was just a mob boss and a guy who ran the city until this episode. But this episode gave him a lot of character, which he really needed. And another complaint I had with this character up until now was that he wasn't badass enough. Like the character in the comics, Ricardo Diaz, or Richard Dragon, which is what his name is in the comics, it's not Ricardo Diaz. The first one was named Richard Dragon, the second one was named Ricardo Diaz, but they're both named Richard Dragon and not the Dragon. But I think they actually did, naming him the Dragon was better than Richard Dragon, because Richard Dragon doesn't really make any sense if you think about it. So Ricardo Diaz and the Dragon works really well, but he's just not badass enough in the show. His comic book counterpart is presumably the best fighter, one of the best fighters in the DC universe. I think he's like the third best fighter, the second best fighter in the whole universe. But in this season, we barely saw him fight. We saw him fight Diggle once, and they were kind of evenly matched, which is stupid. He fought Thea once where he beat Thea, I'm pretty sure, but Thea put up a fight, which is kind of stupid. He's supposed to be one of the best fighters in the entire universe, and he just wasn't badass enough in the show. And this episode didn't make him as badass as he is in the comics, didn't make him as good at fighting, but he did get some great fight scenes. Like most of the time he was using his gun, but he was really good at it, and the fight scenes he was in were really well choreographed. They were great, and even though Laurel obviously did most of the heavy lifting in terms of taking out the bad guys, Diaz's fight scenes were also great. Again, it didn't make him as badass as he was in the comics, but at this point, that's just impossible. I would have preferred if they did. I would have preferred if they actually made him one of the best fighters in the DC universe like he is in the comics. But I guess at this point, this is the best we can get. He's just really good at fighting with a gun. And maybe we see in the trailer in the next episode, he's actually fighting Oliver. So maybe that's the episode where we finally see how good he is at fighting. But this episode, we saw how good he is at fighting with a gun and taking out some bad guys, which was pretty awesome. And the fight scenes we were in, really well choreographed and really great. And also the fight scenes with Black Siren, those were great as well. Speaking of Black Siren, this is the episode where we really see she's starting to have second thoughts. You see, her trying to stop Diaz from killing Jesse, which, by the way, I said I'm going to talk about, but I didn't. But I thought that end scene with Jesse was a great conclusion to that backstory with him, to that storyline. It was very brutal the way Diaz took him out by burning him alive, which is what had made Black Siren have second thoughts. She probably thinks it's too brutal as well, even though she has been brutal in the past. She thinks it's too brutal. When he was torturing that guy, I forgot his name, but that guy, the son of the guy from the Quadrant, Black Siren was clearly having second thoughts then too, and you see throughout the episode that's happening. So I really hope that ends with Black Siren turning on the dragon in the next episode or any of the future episodes, and then teaming up with Green Arrow. Because just imagine a Team Arrow, because we know Arsenal's come back in the next season. So just imagine a Team Arrow with just Green Arrow, Arsenal, and then Black Siren, who could change her name to Black Canary if the other Black Canary retires or dies or something like that. Because this Black Canary, the Laurel Lance version, the Katie Cassidy version, it's better. She's better at portraying the character. So if she joins the team and it's just Green Arrow, Black Canary, and Arsenal, that would be awesome. That's literally my dream Team Arrow. I made a video about it a while ago. It's not a good video because it was made a while ago, but that was my Team Arrow. Those three, and then another hacker guy from the comics who has not appeared yet on the show. So this storyline of Black Siren having second thoughts, and which will probably come to fruition in the next episode, it was actually pretty great. Really, my only problem with the main storyline of this episode was Diaz joining the Quadrant. I don't really have a problem with that. It's just, it doesn't really feel that consequential. It doesn't really feel like it matters. I said in my trailer back down that the thing he's trying to do, for his big plan for the season finale, is probably going to take over the country, because he already has the city, and now he's setting his sights on the country. And I was right. I was. But him joining the Quadrant doesn't really feel like it matters towards that, because first of all, the Quadrant already owns the country, I'm pretty sure, at least a lot of it, so Diaz wouldn't be really taking over anything, he already has it. And second of all, he's not even the head of the Quadrant, so he doesn't really have a main villain status in that respect. He might become the head of the Quadrant in the next couple episodes, which would make him more of a main villain in that respect, and the Quadrant, I guess, would also become sort of main villains, but him joining the Quadrant doesn't really feel like the way to go about him taking over the country, and he probably should have stuck to the city, just because the city is the whole theme of the show. Star City, protecting Star City, saving Star City, and him going to the rest of the country doesn't really feel right. So that's really my only problem with this episode, was him actually joining the Quadrant. I bet it would have felt so much more satisfying if he actually killed the entirety of the Quadrant, and then because he killed the Quadrant, there's this power vacuum, and he uses that to take over the country. That would have been a lot more interesting in my opinion. So that's just my only problem with that storyline. And the last thing that happened in this episode, the last thing to talk about, was the side storyline with Curtis and Felicity, and then Oliver at the end. He was in one scene, like I said. And this storyline I thought would focus entirely around Helix, but that wasn't the case. The synopsis, that's how the synopsis portrayed it, but that just wasn't the case. It wasn't about Helix. It was about Felicity accepting her not being on the team and how scared she was when she couldn't tell where Oliver was, and that actually wasn't bad. Honestly, I expected it to be bad, but it wasn't. It was very realistic. Her reactions were realistic, and her concern for Oliver was realistic. So it wasn't bad at all, and it really and it showed her it showed her how she can accept not being on the team. So that was cool as well. So I thought that this storyline was actually so much better than I expected it to be, and the fact that it wasn't entirely about Helix might have been because of that. Because Helix Dynamics, that storyline is just so uninteresting. That the fact that this storyline wasn't entirely about that wasn't really the main focus of it, actually made it much better than I expected, and there was nothing really wrong with this storyline, so I gotta give them credit for that. Another thing I have a problem with this episode was that Stephen Amell was only in like one scene, and he is the best character in this episode, so if he was just in more scenes, that would have been cool, but I guess they didn't really need to do that. I mean, the last episode he was in like 95% of the scenes, like almost every scene, so I guess he took a break after that in this episode, and it kind of worked. You see a lot of TV shows that do this thing where they have a main focus, a main character, and then they like diverge for one episode, and it works a lot, and honestly in this episode it worked really well. In conclusion, this episode was actually pretty great. The fact that Diaz finally got some development was great, and his backstory and his fight scenes and Laurel having second thoughts and the Felicity side story, all of that was really great. My only problem with the episode was that I felt like Diaz joining the Quadrant was very unsatisfying. He should have killed them and then used the power vacuum to take over the country instead of using the Quadrant. But that's really my only problem with the episode. It's not a huge gripe, it's a small one. So I'll give this episode a 9.2 out of 10. But let me know what you thought about the episode in the comments down below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And follow me on Twitter for better notifications for my videos and daily polls on the Arrowverse. Or if you don't have Twitter or you don't want to follow me, click the notification icon next to the subscribe button because that definitely helps. And thanks for watching.